Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Well, today we're going to have the second part of the conversation around what we do when setbacks come, we get blindsided financially, disappointments that we didn't expect set in. What do we actually do now with the situation that we find ourselves in? And as I mentioned in the last podcast, this practical conversation that I'm going to have today is what we typically start with. And if this is where you're tuning in, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to last week's episode, because we really want to frame our spiritual understanding of what's happening first before we start talking about the practical. We don't want to be thinking of this as our own effort and our own energy with our own resources. We want to be recognizing that God still is the owner of all of this stuff, and He is probably taking us through things for a reason. And we don't want to miss what He has for us in that difficult season. And so please don't skip that conversation. Don't just blow past that and go straight to practical. That's what we normally do because it's easy and it feels controlling. We feel like we can actually take hold of things that we're scared of and that we're wrecked by and just kind of bulldoze and muscle our way through. And I actually think that means that we miss all of the growth that's available to us. So, assuming that you have set that framework well, assuming that you've done the spiritual work to make sure you're maintaining your faithful stewardship, now, what do we do practically? Well, the most important thing that we need to do is understand what has actually happened. Define your reality. Really, 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 what has taken place? We need to strip away all of the catastrophizing and all of the extreme thoughts that our brain will naturally have when we're hit with some unexpected setback. So if you've lost your income to some level, you lost hours at work, or you had to take a demotion, or maybe you lost your job, your income has taken a hit, your cash flow has gone down. Maybe because of some unexpected event, your emergency fund has been drained. Your debt has gone up because you had to finance a new water heater or a new furnace, what have you. You're in a situation where something has changed, but what we will do with that something is we will make it bigger than it actually is a lot of times. We'll tell ourselves a story about what it means. And a lot of times that story is not true. That story of what it means is exaggerated. It's blown out of proportion. And we give ourselves just this relentless level of anxiety and worry because we take this thing and now we've only been thinking about how bad it could become. And now that is what we think is true. And we start acting from that. We start taking steps and making decisions based on that exaggerated version of reality rather than reality. And a lot of times those are super counterproductive. They will reinforce our own misery or our own suffering because we're acting out of this exaggerated story. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's say, for example, that you had, an unexpected bill. The furnace broke. You didn't have enough in your emergency fund to cover all that. So you drained your emergency fund and you're financing some of the cost of that furnace. We can make that mean, we're never going to be able to take another vacation. We've got to sell the car. We've got to, downsize. I've got to work extra hours. We can very quickly start to make the pain compound because we just move into these exaggerated stories, and then we start doing things based on a story that's not real. So first and foremost, really truly define what has happened. What are the numbers? What does this really mean? Has your income reduced by $100 a month, $500 a month? Has your debt that you've taken on hurt your net worth by $1,000, $5,000? What are we really dealing with here? Quantify it, understand it, face it, but face it unemotionally, face it with less fear and exaggeration, and just bottom line it for yourself and for your family. And one thing, just as a side note, it's really important for that to happen as a family. Because if you are exaggerating and exacerbating this story, you're making it sound really, really big, then you're just making this contagious fear happen inside of your family. And everyone now is operating in this anxiety. And a system that's built in chronic anxiety is exhausting. It also sets you up, by the way, for a bit of a boy that cried wolf kind of scenario. If we paint these really big, exaggerated situations, and then we don't actually see those consequences lived out, then people stop trusting the story that you're telling. They start to kind of dismiss the levels of anxiety that you're trying to bring into the situation. And maybe something bad does happen that's really significant, but people don't actually believe it's that significant because you've kind of played those cards in the past and they don't trust it anymore. And so it's really important that we stay relatively unemotional and just face our reality with the data and share that with our family so that we recognize this is what happened, this is what it actually costs, and this is what that actually means. And we're not overreacting, we're not panicking, but we are going to have to make some decisions, and these are our options. That's the kind of process we want to go through practically. Once we have established what the reality is that we're facing, then we can start to change it. I find that more often than not, people start changing things before they actually understand reality. And they're changing things that they don't actually realize aren't helping them. So you can go into a fit of panic and make a bunch of changes about something that you don't actually understand, but it's probably not going to fix the problem. It might actually make the problem worse in a lot of cases. And so once we've established what that real cost is, what has actually changed, how does this affect you, really? Then we need to start laying out our priorities to make sure that we protect the things that are most important and we are willing to let go of the things that aren't important. We tend to get this backwards a lot of times. So, for example, we may continue to pay for things that are absolutely unnecessary but may feel insignificant while we take a really big change in something that's significant. So maybe you panic, you sell one of your cars, you completely stop adding to your retirement savings accounts, you blow out of all the things that are actually really important priorities. Maybe you end up downsizing your house. You move into a different apartment because you just say, look, we just got to do something drastic. Meanwhile, you're paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month on things that you actually don't care as much about. This membership or that, sports event or these tickets or that entertainment, those all add up, but they're insignificant individually. And so we keep the stuff that actually isn't as important to us and we start cutting the stuff that matters the most to our family. And so by slowing down and understanding what's happening, we can then start to set priorities in place to say, these are the things that we really want to hold on to no matter what. We want to continue to live in this place. We want to continue to send our kids to this school, whatever those things might be. Now, if those things are true and we've lost this much income or we have this much more in cash flow to support the debt that we just took on, then what down the line in priorities is actually the stuff that we should be cutting. We need to lay those things out as a family. Again, this is not something that should be decided in a vacuum, because if we're cutting something that we decided to cut, but we didn't actually bring into the conversation the person who was impacted by that decision, then we're setting ourselves up for a lot of resentment and anger. If, for example, one of the things that has to go in order for all these other things to be maintained is that one of your kids can't do the travel sports team anymore because the costs of the trips and the costs of the membership to that are way too high, but you just make that decision arbitrarily without letting them in to the fullness of why that is the decision that you feel you need to make, then they weren't part of that conversation, and their only option is to assume that you did it because you're selfish, or to assume that you did it because you're irresponsible. But when you let everyone into the conversation and you lay out the priorities in front of them, then as a family, you can choose together to cut the things that should be cut. And now the consequences of that decision are all agreed on. Everyone says this makes sense. This is the thing that has to go. I understand. But we don't tend to do that because we act in a rush. We speed through things and we just start changing things that we don't understand. And we are creating consequences that become kind of like a wrecking ball to the relationships that we're trying to maintain. So lay out the priorities, understand the stuff that needs to be protected, and understand what needs to go in order to protect those highest priorities. One of those really important priorities needs to be reestablishing your margin, creating some cushion, building back up your emergency fund if it has been blown through because of this event that happened. We need to be able to get to a place where we can stand confidently and know that we have reestablished and resecured that cushion that allows us to be ready for the next setback, because it's coming. They come. Sometimes they come in batches. And so we need to be prepared to get back to a solid level so that the next one doesn't just drive us deeper into fear and anxiety. Once we've established those priorities and we know what needs to happen next, then we can start to make the changes in our plan. We can start to make adjustments in our spending plan. If this is what we're cutting, then that grabs back this much cash flow, which means we're putting this much toward the emergency fund for the next X number of months. We're putting this much towards that debt that we just took on to make sure that we get that knocked out in a reasonable period of time. And so you're starting to recognize how this spending plan is going to readjust in order for you to achieve the target that you're setting out. We don't need to pay this off tomorrow, but we do need to pay it off. So we don't need to overreact and make massive changes, but we do need to make the changes that we need to make. And what does that mean? Map that out with specificity, because it will allow you to know when you can re-inject the things that you took out. So if we're going to do this until this emergency fund is built back up, we're going to do this until that debt is paid off. Once that's done, then we're back to where we were before. And we can re-engage with the things that we had to exclude. We can get back into that sporting event. We can get back into those tickets or that membership or whatever it is that we want to do. So one of the things that process helps us with is that potential for us to perpetualize these things, to say we're never going to get to do this again. That thought is so destructive. When we map it out and say, when this is done, then we get to do this again. It does two things. One is it gives us a perspective that recognizes our reality. This is a season. This is not forever. So we don't make it mean that it's never going to happen. It also gives us the motivation to do the things we have to do in order to get back in to the stuff that we're cutting out, right? So it is a win in both directions. If I just get to here, then I can have this back. And when I get to here, which isn't going to take forever, I will have this back. It gives the family a recognition of the season that you're in, and that season is not going to last forever. And it gives them the motivation to get to the end of that season as quickly as possible. We also want to recognize the levers that we can pull to make those things happen quicker. So maybe as you look at your overall situation, you say, in order for this to really happen in a timeline that keeps us on track, I'm going to have to take on a gig job. I'm going to have to do some Uber or Lyft driving, or I'm going to have to deliver for DoorDash or Amazon or whatever the case may be. I'm going to have to pick up some gig income because it's easier for me to inject extra cash flow for this season to get these things done. But just like these other pieces, when we get to this end goal, when we have exited this season, that means I can put this back. I can stop doing these things. I can stop sacrificing extra hours. One of the mistakes I want us to avoid that will trick our brain into perpetualizing these things all the time is if when we get to the end of this season, we don't let go of the extra that we're sacrificing in order to get to the end, then it does feel like it lasts forever. In other words, if we start to get used to that extra income and we spend it, then we're going to perpetuate the fact that I have to keep working these extra hours. I have to keep doing these gig economy kind of things in order to fill up our spending plan. And we become addicted to that extra income, and it forces us to perpetuate. It forces this thing to keep happening long after the season that we were in is over. If we have to sacrifice a certain spend, the sports team, for example, but because we fill our spending up with other things unintentionally and emotionally, when we get to the end of the season, we don't add that back. We find ourselves with evidence that these seasons will never end, right? So we do need to lay out these seasons really intentionally to say, when we get this debt paid off, or when we get this emergency fund built back up, then we're turning back on the things that we turned off. We're gaining back the time that we're sacrificing right now to make more income. We're gaining back the travel sports team or the events that we like to go to, or the entertainment money that we weren't spending in this season. We're going to get it back. Because if we just make the new normal, then our brain has proof that when these events happen, it does change things forever. And that is really hard to maintain hope, to maintain the motivation, to get through the season when we have reason to believe the season's never going to end. So the bottom line of this work is that it can't be done without the right spiritual perspective. When we are walking into this season with an eternal perspective, we recognize the seasonality of life, and we are less emotional, less panicked when we face these setbacks and these hardships. When we step into it with a faithful stewardship mindset rather than an ownership mindset, we don't immediately try to grab control and make decisions that are actually counterproductive. We ask the owner of the resources what he would have us do. We can hold on to hope and joy in the midst of the hard because we recognize this is how growth happens. Failure is not the opposite of success. It's the process of success. We need these seasons. We need friction in our lives in order to make progress. This is how this works. And so we can step into the practical blocking and tackling kind of work of mapping out priorities and understanding the changes we need to make without over emotionally reacting and creating outcomes that give our brain more evidence to believe that we're never going to get to do this, or we're never going to get out of this season. It is our spiritual framework that allows us to do the practical work well. And so these can't be separated They have to be one. We have to be doing both. When we walk in to these types of seasons of struggle and suffering and pain with this spiritual mindset intact, the work that we do, the practical work that we do, will be more effective, more efficient, and will actually gain what there is to gain in terms of wisdom and growth and learning in the season, and share not only the spiritual experience with others, but the practical steps as well. When these two are combined, we grow through these seasons and we hold tight to joy, and we actually make more progress. And that is what faithful stewardship looks like. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.